Welcome. And good evening, Norwich. If you're watching in Norwich, greetings from London. If you're watching this debate in the future, because it's been recorded, greetings from the past. Greetings from Blade Runner month, because it's November 2019, which is the month in which Blade Runner fictionally takes place. It's a great pleasure to me to be back with all of you and with another great panel for a data debate. I will introduce them shortly. The way we'll run tonight is we have an hour and a half. So we have a great panel, but we've asked them to keep their introductions ridiculously short, 5 minutes each, so that we have a lot of time to make a genuine debate. The clue's in the name. That also means that when we do come out to you, we'll have as much time as possible for you to contribute, both here in the room and from Norwich or online, thanks to the hashtag, which we said before. We will try and take 3 or 4 points at a time so that the panel can respond in a more organic way rather than a question and 4 people answering it. And they don't have to be questions. We don't ask you to pretend you're asking a question. Just make a point. It's a debate. We want to actually get a discussion going here. I am going to cruelly keep the panel to ridiculously short introductions using the yellow and red card scheme. So when they have a minute left, they will get a yellow card. And if they're still talking at 5 minutes, they'll get a red card. They already know this, but I'm telling you because if you start making points from the floor that I feel are going on a bit too long, you will also get a yellow card, and don't make me use a red card on you. That's all I'm saying. So yeah, do wait for the microphone to reach you, unless, of course, you've lied about being here tonight, in which case write a question down, hand it to the person next to you and get them to read it out, or disguise your voice. Either of those is fine. And then, yeah, so hopefully we'll have maximum time for you all to contribute your thoughts and your points of view. So what I'm going to do is introduce all of the panel, and then they will make their introductions one at a time. So first of all, we're going to hear from Rob Proctor, who very kindly stepped in literally at half an hour's notice. Had he not been in the building, he would have escaped. But he very willingly stepped up. I have to say, we hardly had to blackmail him at all. He is a Turing Faculty Fellow and also a Professor of Social Informatics at Warwick University. And he's been doing work on fake news detection and also on how journalists can go about verifying sources from social media, all of which is extremely timely. I mean, really, I suppose we should express our gratitude to politicians of all stripes, first of all, for making this even more topical by calling a general election, which obviously happened since we scheduled it, and secondly, for giving us a lot of material to discuss this evening on all sides. The second panelist we're going to hear from is Yulan He, who's a Professor of Computer Science at the University of Warwick. Good showing from Warwick this evening. And her work centres on using statistical models to represent uncertainty. And the research topics include sentiment analysis and opinion mining, so obviously expression of opinions and feelings online, and using social media analytics. We're next going to hear from another Turing Fellow, Bertie Vidgen, who's a researcher on 2 of the Alan Turing Institute's projects, the Misinformed Citizen, miss in brackets, and hate speech measure and countermeasures. So his main research is focused on detecting and analysing and countering online hate speech using computational social science methods. And then last of all, we're going to hear from Chloe Colliver from ISD Global, where she leads the Digital Analysis Unit. It's a London-based think tank. So heading the programme of research, exploring the tactics and actors and systems involved in the promotion of terrorism, extremism and disinformation online, and designing responses to these kinds of digital threats. So that includes working with national governments to design digital policy regulation. So again, horribly timely, in fact, given today's events. So we're going to hear from them in that order, and then we're going to come out and hear what you think. So let me get my timer going. It's a bit old school. So first of all, Rob, would you like to give us your 5 minutes of thoughts for which you've had either a lifetime or half an hour to prepare, depending on which way you look at it?
Yes, and it'll be the audience challenge to decide whether it was 5 minutes or a lifetime. So I'd like to begin with a quote, if I may, from an article written by John Norton. Some of you may be aware of his journalism. In a recent article, he stated that the marketplace of ideas has suffered a technology-induced market failure, bringing inscrutability and fragility and accelerating the decline of trust in the system. One of the consequences of this has been the pollution of the public sphere. Accordingly, these developments may pose an existential threat for liberal democracy. So he's clearly telling us that technology has created a problem, is the cause of the challenge of fake news, that it's undermining our trust in information online, and therefore we are in a position where we can't trust anything that we see today. And what he's pointing to that technology has done is to create a system of disintermediation, by which I mean that many people celebrate this. Anybody can post information online without having it go through any kind of fact-checking process. Now, we celebrate that as a way of promoting the circulation of ideas, promoting debate, and so forth. And indeed, when social media first made an impact in the world, we were talking about how it had enabled the spread of democracy in states which had not previously enjoyed that particular freedom. Of course, as we look now several years on from those days, we begin to understand that being able to post information online without any fact-checking can lead to problems, the kind of problems that John Norton is pointing to. Inevitably, I suppose, when we have a problem like this caused by technology, we imagine whether technology can provide a solution. The reach of social media makes it very easy for information to spread quickly. It has overwhelmed the capacity of the fact-checking mechanisms that has been historically in place. We know that we can develop techniques which may help to expose information that is untrue, and perhaps this, therefore, will be a solution to the challenge of making rumour less effective and fake news, bringing it back under some kind of control. But we also know that for any solution you come up with technically, you can find a counter technology which will, in fact, avoid what the technology solution is trying to do. So bad actors will always come up with ways of subverting a technology, and there'll always perhaps be some kind of race between those who are trying to control fake news by the use of technology and those who are trying to use technology to further fake news. And recent examples of where technology is actually accelerating fake news come in the form of what's known as deep fakes, which some of you may have heard about, which uses AI to produce very convincing video of people saying things that, in fact, they never said, and therefore introducing a new layer of complexity when it comes to being able to detect whether that information is actually being truthfully presented. So there are question marks, I think, about whether technology can provide a solution to a problem that arguably technology has actually created in the first place. So I would say we need to look further than technology, and we need to, I think, look at fact-checking as a task, as a responsibility that needs to be reinserted into the process of producing news and distributing opinions. So Veracity has traditionally been the responsibility of journalists who, by training and experience, apply certain standards to what they've been prepared to put out into the public domain. The new media landscape, of course, means that journalists are no longer the gatekeepers in this process. So perhaps we need to think about ways in which they can be reinserted and we can re-intermediate the process of putting information out into the media landscape. And there are already examples of where I think media companies are beginning to accept that this is a responsibility that they need to be able to undertake and discharge. Initially, you may recall Facebook and others have declared that they're not news organizations, they're merely an infrastructure that allows information to pass from one person to another. And they're no more responsible for what that information than, say, is the telephone system. I think they are beginning now to understand that perhaps they cannot excuse their role in the process of fake news distribution. And indeed, we know that governments are now taking steps in order to encourage social media platforms to rethink that position. And indeed, they are beginning to do that now, so that Facebook and others are beginning to employ fact checkers in a way which will perhaps help to introduce intermediation into the process of the generation of information and news. So they are now beginning to accept that they have a role as a publisher and the responsibilities that the publisher would need to discharge. And that point is undermined by the recent report by the Department of Communication, Media and Sport. And they are, I think, encouraging tech companies to adopt a more proactive role, perhaps even ultimately through legal liability for the content that they put out into the world. So I think we're looking at a problem which, although it may have been provoked by technology, is socio-technical. And we need socio-technical solutions. We need to encourage social media platforms and other distributors of information to re-examine their role in the process and to accept a responsibility in creating an ecosystem of information which citizens can have some trust and faith in, and therefore they can be guided and make decisions on the basis of information which has some reliability and robustness. And I think we all know in today's complex society, we need information that is trustworthy more than ever. Thank you.
Marvellous, thank you, Rob. Not bad for half an hour's prep, hey? It's almost like he knows what he's talking about. So there's a great exposition of the problem and some of the proposed solutions. So we'll get to discuss some of them. So, Yulan, are you going to go and use the? You have some visual aids as well, don't you?
Right. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the preliminary work we have done using machine learning for this Rumour veracity detection in social media. Right. So the Rumour, basically, like there's like many different definitions of Rumour, right? So one particular definition we use here is actually like if there's some item of circulating information, but then whose veracity status is yet to be verified, then that's what we call Rumour. Okay. I suppose like everybody knows like why we care about this Rumour veracity, sort of like a verification problem. And then, but then the question here is, can we actually like do something to automatically flag if there's like a Rumour being false, right? So that's the kind of like a purpose what we want to do here. Now, so we have this kind of like data set up here. So given some original tweet. Right, so we have yet to verify its veracity. Then sometimes like we could have some so-called context information, right? So essentially like you will see some other people reply to this post or they comment on this particular post. And you could also see like there's some people either raise their sort of like concern about this particular tweet, right? So they might say something to deny it. So basically like this particular tweet is false, or there's like people actually query about this, the veracity of this particular tweet, or some other people simply comment on this, sort of like a tweet. So essentially, like, we could frame it as a kind of a two-stage processing. So in the first stage, we try to do this so-called stance classification of the comments. Essentially, we want to classify the user comment into one of the four categories. So either the comment support this veracity of this original tweet, rumor, or they denied the veracity of the rumor, or they raise their queries, or they simply just comment on the original tweet, right, without expressing their stance. So once we have these stance labels for the comments from the user comments, then we can combine this so-called user comments contextual information to train another machine learning model to do this rumor veracity classification. So classify this particular tweet into either true, false, or unverified. Okay. Now we have done some preliminary experiments on the SAM-eval data, so basically some kind of like Twitter data. So we look into both the Reddit data and also Twitter data. And basically, like for each original tweet, we collect all the user comments, and then kind of annotate those user comments with the label here. So like one of these four stance classes. And then for the second stage, then we also do kind of like labeling. So for each original tweet, we label it as either true, false, or unverified. So you can see that the annotated data we have here is pretty small, right? So because of this expensive human annotation process. Now for the first stage, to classify the user comments, now what we can do is we could create this so-called conversation tree, right? So if there's some source tweet posted, then we collect all the other users' comments on this particular tweet, and then we will end up with this conversation tree. If we take one of the branch from this conversation tree, then we would have this sequence of user comments, right? So we can fit into some kind of a neural network architecture to tell us the final class of this particular user comment. But the performance we got is actually quite low. So we only obtained 0.46 in terms of some accuracy evaluation metric. So that's the first stage, to classify the user comment into one of these four stance classes. Now in the second stage, so once we have the user comments stance labels, then we combine it with some of the other user meta information relating to the original tweet. And then again, we train some neural network model to tell us the final class label of this particular tweet. So whether this tweet is false, true, or unverified. And again, the performance is quite low. So you can see how difficult the problem is to train some machine learning model to do this automatically, veracity verification on the tweet data. Now, there are some limitations here. So you can see that we rely on some annotations to train our machine learning model. And then this annotation basically would be very expensive, rely on heavy human manual effort. So can we have a certain way to automatically detect the stance of the user comments without relying on these human annotations? Now, on the other hand, the data we use, they are event specific. So usually, like, all these kind of tweets, they relating to some specific real-world event. So the model trained on that particular data basically would be very difficult to be generalized to some other unseen events in the future. So we raise two different questions, whether we can automatically extract the events from the tweets without relying on any annotations, and to identify the key claims made on those tweet clusters, and then to do the kind of tracking. Now, another thing is whether we could gather some external evidences for this rumor veracity classification. So next, I'll just tell you some of our work towards this kind of direction. So the first thing we did is whether we could do this automatic detection of stance of comments without relying on any annotations. Now, again, given this Twitter conversation, so here we see, we show like, 4 different kinds of messages. So each message, they cover some topics. And then we also like, have this statement, comment, question, and agreement. So those are the human like label just to show you, they basically like denote how user frame their kind of message, right? So basically like the 2 things, one is a topic, the other one is like how user say about it, and then usually we call it discourse. And then we have some kind of like model proposed which can actually automatically extract this discourse rows. So this is discourse rows. You can see that they somehow will correspond to the stance of the comments. I will skip this one and then skip this one, and then so the next thing is about like we do some automatic event extraction from Twitter. So essentially like given lots of like Twitter data, we would like to convert it into some structure form. So what's this tweet about? Stuff like the information about what happened, when, where, to whom, and why. So that's what we call event. So the thing is like if you have lots of tweets mentioning the same event, then we could have trained some machine learning model, explore this redundancy to extract this sort of like event structure. So we have some kind of like model proposed to automatically do this event extraction from large-scale Twitter without relying on any labeled data. So essentially like we could produce these visualization results where you see the relevant events they are putting together. So essentially like we do this automatically tweet clustering. So this is just another more recent approach, which we show like there's 10 different events, and then they kind of like denoted by different color from Twitter data sets and also from news article data set. Now I would like to end my talk with this automatic generation of fake news. Right, so basically like you could just type in a starting kind of like a statement here. For example, like I just type in something like Hillary won the US general election in 2020. So this is fake, right? And then I fit into some language modeling, so kind of like automatic sort of like a machine learning model. And this is the news which automatically generated by the model. So I will leave you to read this kind of fake news. Right, so that's the end of my talk. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. I must say, it is nice to actually hear an explanation of how AI can be used to detect fake news, because it's something we often hear like, oh yes, it's being used to do this, but to actually have somebody take us through how that works is really nice, really useful. Thanks. So she hasn't won next year's election. Okay. So, Bertie, what are you going to tell us about?
I'm going to talk about very similar things, actually.
Good,
That's
excellent.
no surprise. Oh, perfect. Great. Cool. So I'm just going to start by talking about how we tackle fake news. And the most common way of doing that is to use fact-checking, as we've already heard about. And what we do there is we take bits of content which we think are amenable to being checked empirically, and we have people who can do that. So expert fact-checkers, organizations, often using a combination of their own expertise and computational tools. But of course, it's incredibly controversial. So I'm sure no one's missed Fact Check UK, which is the short-lived fact-checking service from the Conservative Party last week, which lasted a couple of hours. And then it went away again, which was very strange. But it is a very difficult thing to do, and it's always very politically sensitive. Nonetheless, it seems to make sense. If we want to get rid of fake news, we should check facts. We should try and use evidence to deal with that problem. So let's say, hypothetically, I tell you that my jumper's blue, and you decide that you don't agree with me, and you say, no, it's green. You've got it massively wrong. We could potentially give that to a fact checker, and they could tell us which one of us is right, and then we could kind of move on to more pressing issues. Well, that's the idea, but sadly that's not the case. So I'm sure we can all recognize this, the famous photo of the dress from 4 or 5 years ago, and it went viral exactly because of this problem. People could not agree what color it was. Now, for me, it's blue and gold, but I'm sure for some people here, it wasn't. For lots of people, it was black and blue, it was white and gold. We couldn't agree on the color of it. We were looking at the exact same thing, but we all had very different ideas about what it is. And I think this is actually the perfect analogy for modern politics. We're all looking at the same thing, but we have very different perspectives and we reach very, very different conclusions. And I think it's quite dangerous when we start to think that our political disagreements can be solved just by tackling the problem of fake news. That was one of the big claims during the Brexit campaign. A lot of the, in the aftermath, a lot of the people from the Remain camp came out saying, Leave voters would have voted to Remain if only they'd had all the information. If there hadn't been so much fake news, Donald Trump got to where he was because of fake news. There may be some truth in that. I don't want to completely deny it. But I think when we start to make those claims, we not only misunderstand the motivations of Leave voters or people who support Donald Trump, we also misunderstand the nature of contemporary politics. And I think the real issue, as actually we've already heard from the previous speakers, this is only going to get worse. So this is a photo of someone who does not exist. It's from a website called This Person Does Not Exist. Very well named. And they use the kind of computer models we've heard about and machine learning to auto-generate images of people who do not exist. And you cannot, at least to me, they're very, very hard to distinguish from a real photo. And okay, this is just a photo. But there are more advanced forms coming out all the time. So videos, which actually at the moment the videos do look quite dodgy. They sort of look like stick men moving around. But it's going to keep getting better. And we're going to see audio where you can't tell that it's not real. And this is going to have fundamental implications for our politics. And I think there's the obvious problem that we're going to start seeing content that we think is true and isn't. But we're also going to have the opposite problem. We're going to see content that isn't, we're just going to see a lot of issues around truth in this space, actually, before I get all tongue-tied. And of course, the real issue is that we're going to lose faith in the truth of evidence we're presented with. There's going to be this uncertainty around the evidence that we use in political debate, and that's going to have the really long-term problems. And of course, this has been going on for a long time. If you look back at the Russian Revolution in the 1920s, Stalin came along with basically a little eraser, and he rubbed out Lenin from every photo doing anything impressive ever. So this isn't a new problem per se, this problem of manipulating information, presenting people with fake evidence, but the scale at which it operates today is completely unprecedented. And I think we're completely unprepared for the implications of that for political discourse. But I'd like to finish with a provocation by saying that I think fake news might itself be a form of fake news. I'm not sure that fake news is the major problem that we face. So I think we like to blame fake news for the political differences we have, for the way that things have gone in the last few years, which many people are concerned about. But actually, fake news might be the symptom of some much more underlying, deep-rooted problems in our society and our politics than it is the cause. And unless we can address that, unless we start to think about fake news in those terms, I think we're always going to slightly misunderstand the problem and not deal with it in the most effective way. I think I'm bang on 5 minutes.
Dude, you are bang on 5 minutes. Very
Brilliant.
impressive. Thank you, Bertie.
Great.
Is fake news? And does that affect what we do about it? So I hope you're going to draw these things together and give us the answer, Chloe.
Well, of course.
In 5 minutes flat.
Just a small task then. I'm glad to follow on actually just from what Bertie was saying. The first thing I wanted to talk about was how often people in this field get asked to go and talk about the issue of trust in media or trust in institutions or trust in information. And I think that misses the slight problem at the moment of trustworthiness. And I think the context in which we're having this debate and this discussion is the ideal one to discuss the issue of trustworthiness, and that focusing on the issue of fake news is ignoring that wider context in which users and the public and consumers online don't necessarily have a good reason to be trusting information as it is. And fake news doesn't exist in a vacuum. So there was a study done by YouGov and Cambridge University earlier this year that showed that Britons had the lowest trust in information online of any major developed country in the world. 12% of people who were surveyed trusted the information that they got from Facebook, Google, or Twitter. Given what we've heard already today, I think it's safe to say that there's probably quite good reasons for a level of mistrust of that scale. But I think what I wanted to talk about a little bit first was that I think we're misframing the problem when we're thinking about fake news. And this follows on from Bertie well, I think. The problem isn't fake news, it's the system that incentivizes fake news that scales it, that amplifies it, and that targets it. There have always been lies and there will always be lies, and any attempt to pretend that we can regulate away lies and deception is both fooling itself but also a dangerous authoritarian one. So I think what we need to think about when we're dealing with the issue of fake news and how it's beginning to affect our society is about the business models that underpin a culture in which fake news is incentivized, the bar is very low for entry, and that an attention economy, which naturally came out of a surplus of information, has naturally become an outrage economy. So I'm going to move a little bit on to trying to think about what we can do to solve some of these problems. And the first thing I'm going to talk about a little bit is the government's role in that and regulation. And that's a discussion that's been going on here in the UK for about 2 or 3 years now. It's at the heart of the EU's discussions around what to do about American tech companies at the moment and in other countries around the world. There's a dangerous tendency, I think, at the moment to be regulating content. And the obsession with thinking that fake news is the problem, it's what's leading governments to try and define a truth and a lie and to try and limit that through law. We've seen in the world of terrorism and extremism, which is where my company's work started, that trying to define these very difficult political categories is nigh on impossible and leads you into dangerous, overbearing censorship on certain issues. So what do we do instead? Well, there are really interesting developments in thinking about how we can regulate the systems and processes that enable fake news to spread and be targeted in the way that they currently are. So we can think about transparency. If people knew who was targeting them and why they were able to be targeted with that fake news, they can make a much freer decision over whether they're going to trust that information or not. Transparency can lie at the heart of regulation, like it does in some other business sectors, like increasingly financial regulation and the decision-making algorithms that decide on financial decisions. We can think about transparency in terms of content moderation, so transparency of why would a tech company take something down or leave something up online. We can think about transparency in terms of appeals processes, so if you're a user and you've been denied your free speech because someone has taken down a piece of content claiming it's fake news, you need some transparency over a process where you can appeal that decision. We can think about transparency of advertising, so the business model that underlies so many of our online systems these days, and that's been a big part of the conversation around this election. But thinking about if you're being paid, if you're being targeted by paid fake news content, at least having the ability to know who is doing that and why. And finally, transparency of algorithmic output itself. And this is the most tricky bit, and I hope we can get into a bit of a discussion on this one, but there are some really interesting models about how a regulator can maybe white box test the outcomes of algorithms and the potential bias that is in the systems that are creating those decisions. So I'm laying that out there as one bit of the problem-solving arena, but I think just quickly to say that regulation is only one part of the solution here. We've heard about fact-checking already, and I think regulation comes alongside competition and education as the other things we need to think about here. So what I mean by competition is other voices that can try and challenge and fight back against false information and false narratives. Until we have a level playing field of tech companies that are transparent, that we're able to understand why information is targeted, we're not going to be able to have a very good competitive strategy for providing true and verified and evidence-based information. And then finally, education. And I don't mean just children in schools, I mean real public awareness raising about the systems that are producing fake news, the systems that are targeting you with fake news, and the way that your data is used in those systems to propagate an ecosystem of false and misleading information. So I'm going to leave it there with those 3 ideas for how we can start to tackle this problem.
Brilliant, thank you, Chloe. Well, panel, I think you've done a marvellous job of taking us right through from, if you like, the start of the problem through different ways of looking at the problem and indeed potential solutions, but not in any easy way. So I think you've given us plenty to start from, to discuss. Do feel free to ask questions because we have absolutely fantastic range and depth of expertise on the platform, but feel equally free to express your thoughts. We've had some really difficult questions here raised, I think, about what we do about misinformation, disinformation online, especially that may have been put out there deliberately in order to manipulate us about important things. And I mean, you've all been quite circumspect talking about specific things, apart from the pop-up fact check the Twitter account. But I think that there is a lot to talk about that's going on at the moment. Lots of things in the election campaign that you might not call exactly fake news, but you might not call reliable and truthful information either. And the question about, is that something that we'd want to regulate? And if so, who gets to regulate it? Given that sometimes it's politicians we're looking at. So I'm going to come out. Now, I would ask you one thing. Don't be shy, because we have around 45 minutes left. What I don't want is that you all sit there very quietly for the first half an hour, and then in the last 50 minutes, you all want to say something when we don't have time to fit you in. This goes for you in Norwich as well, by the way. All right, if you've got questions, get your thumbs going now, and we'll try and get as many people in as possible, because I don't want to reach the end and say, sorry, I didn't have time for anybody. So let's see, hands. Oh, good, you see, hands going. Okay, so we've got somebody down the front, we've got somebody up there. Have we got 2 microphones? Maybe we could do one there and get the other one to the front row next, and then we'll work around. Okay, go for it.
Hi, thank you. So I just wanted to sort of expand the debate to a different type of problem, because I think so far we're only discussing the realm of politics and maybe Twitter comments and so on and so forth. To bring an example from India, where WhatsApp forwards are used to spread misinformation about people that they might be child abductors, and specifically with photos of those people, has led to mob lynchings and like deaths of a lot of people. So like, and the solutions that we have seen, for example, a machine learning model to detect if a tweet is genuine or not, clearly would not apply in that model. Plus, there would not be enough time to verify that information, because all of these messages spread virally, and within a matter of hours, someone is either dead or injured grievously. So, like, do you think, first of all, like a broader question, are there solutions being discussed or designed to tackle these kind of cases where the response time needs to be really high and we can't wait for data to be collected? And secondly, should it be a punishable offense to spread misinformation on the digital platform, which of course we do not have a counterpart in the physical space, because I can go about the streets shouting lies, but I wouldn't be sent to jail for that. But should we do that for the digital world, is the second question.
Good point. You might be, actually, if you went around the street saying this person is a child abductor. I mean, I think Elon Musk is on trial for pretty much that right now. But I think you're right. I think the spreading private messages through online networks is another level of problem, because by their nature they're private and yet they have a very real public impact. So very good question. So you have the microphone, and other people, if you put your hands up again, and then we'll get the microphone. Okay, perfect. So yeah, if you go.
I'll come on to a question, just a comment, which is fine dealing with assertions that are obviously wrong. I think Donald Trump, for example. What about facts? You know, I can select facts to my advantage. The facts might be correct. They may not give the whole truth. And when it comes to something like, will the 32-hour week cause problems, opinion, trickle-down effect, come onto it? And looking at full fact, they're very good, but actually dealing with some of the manifestos, they are struggling a little bit and basically saying, yes, well, it could be right, but we're not entirely sure about that. My question is really Chloe's point about education. I mean, I think education must be the answer, but then I think, how do you do it? Is it going to work? And the really question to everyone is, do you think they're young, and well, I know 50% are going to university, 50% aren't, do they know how to deal with it? To me, it's worrying they're getting their information from news feeds. That seems dangerous, but maybe that's what they want. Maybe it's okay. Maybe they know how to deal with it. So, you know, teaching youngsters either at primary school, secondary school, that's difficult. What about the older people who've been through education? Probably it's less educated people who are going to be more susceptible. How do you deal with that? Great education, how do you actually achieve it?
Okay, good point. How do you actually do it? So, Marvus, yeah, if you'd like to get that microphone to there, and you've got a microphone, off you go.
Is it me?
Yes, it is you.
Oh, okay. I wonder why we've left our adult selves who've been on the planet for centuries behind when we try and talk about these issues. I mean, we're sitting in the British Library where I'm fortunate, as somebody who's been a journalist for most of my life, to have gained a great deal of my information from. And as regards sources, I'm trying to bring ideas together. As a journalist, I wouldn't get my information from The Sun. That's me personally, and I wouldn't believe, for me personally, that anything I read in there had value. I would go somewhere else for that. So in all of this argument about technology, which I use, it seems that we have the cart leading the horse all the way through. Because when we come to education, we've got a firm like Amazon, which is using its social responsibility budget to give children in McDonald's devices from which they can read one of Amazon's top-rated books, which does not relate to what the Sunday Times top-rated would be, or what children's publishers have published as being books that children can read. So what am I saying, really? It's that education is vital, but we were there before, and we came here to a situation where we don't know what we're doing with a stream of technologies that have monetized us and made us less helpful than we were before. And this gentleman's point here is so poignant. Obviously media has its great advantages, but I really wonder at some of the questions we're asking about what we're doing here. They have to go, as Bertie said, far, far deeper for the source. And the source lies partly in the greed of people who wish to manipulate us. A small group of people wish to manipulate us so that we're running around like lemmings. I only look at my emails twice a day, that's it. It doesn't get any more attention from me because I have a life and I have other things to do. But I think I've given enough thoughts for now. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah, if I can encourage you to be as pithy as possible. Everyone so far has a lot of really important stuff to say, and I don't want to cut everyone short, but yeah, be as concise as you can in the interesting things you have to say. Off you go. With that renewed pressure.
I will try my best. So I just want to leverage on something that Hillary Clinton wrote about in her last book about her lesson learned about the fake news attack she witnessed. She also expressed that the French learned about it and they sent a team of very young people to the States learning from it. And I witnessed the attack that Macron got on fake news a certain day. And I just want to understand, based on what you presented, what are the type of AI algorithm or approach that they used, and how have we learned from that, and can it be now reproduced in all the cases of when we have election or other type of important political events?
That's a very good point, actually. Are you all familiar with this example in France where there was a massive attempt to use fake news during an election, and somehow they were aware of it beforehand and countered it? So maybe you could come back and give us a bit of detail on that. In fact, let's take a pause and come back to the panel, and if between you could answer all those thoughts, that'd be great. So we've got using platforms like WhatsApp to spread malicious rumours that incite violence. We've got the problem that it's not necessarily false information, but by selecting facts, you can give a misleading impression. And is there anything you can do about that? We've got the idea that maybe we used to be a bit more careful about checking our sources and we're now less careful. I don't know. I'm not sure if that's true. By the way, actually, I would like to speak it up in defence of The Sun, because if you want to understand a science story in one paragraph, then you should go to papers like The Sun, because they do a remarkable job of putting across information in incredibly short and readable forms. So I'd like to slightly defend them. And also this story about the fake news attack in France and how they detected and how they dealt with it, I think would be a really interesting case study. Would you like to start us off with that, and then we'll come back to
Yeah, happy to. So it was a really interesting example, and actually I don't think it was necessarily the technology that made the difference, which goes a little bit to the kind of socio-technological things that Rob was talking about earlier. From what I know of what they did, it was actually as much a kind of public awareness raising and political awareness raising activity as it was a technological one. It was slightly different in that there was a hack and a kind of cyber attack involved, which actually is more detectable in a lot of ways than just an information attack. So there was actually, you know, a kind of visible cyber attack that was involved at some point. And that does make a little bit of a difference in terms of detectability. But what they were able to do, and also the Swedish government did this before their election, and recently the Canadian government before their election, they put a lot of money and resources into public awareness raising campaigns for about 6 months before the election, so quite a long time, around the dangers of misinformation online, the kind of critical awareness that you should have as a user, but also for politicians and policymakers and candidates. They did kind of special trainings around what to look out for, suspicious signals, what to do if there is mis or disinformation circulating about you, the party, or an issue that's relevant. And actually we saw in both Canada and Sweden in particular, that was very helpful in enabling an ecosystem of people who are very involved in the kind of mainstream conversation to have a real awareness around these threats and what they might look like. It obviously doesn't prevent it happening. It also just puts a bar up against really low-hanging fruit for bad actors. They know people are watching. They know that there might be some kind of system in place to monitor that if they are doing that in a malicious way. So actually, most of the French example was just kind of public awareness raising and political awareness raising around what to do in a case of scenario, and also not to over-report it. So they were told very heavily not to sensationalize the potential impact of an information attack, which I think meant that the value of it was less for the perpetrator. And if I can also just touch quickly on the WhatsApp question, which I think is a really important one. So to one of your points, yes, there is research done on what we can do to try and minimize the impact of disinformation on WhatsApp. A researcher at Harvard University has been doing research on India, Indonesia, and Mexico, I believe, on disinformation on WhatsApp groups. During his research in India, WhatsApp made a change to both the group number and the forwarding capabilities in groups. And he said that it changed the spread and the speed of the spread of disinformation by an order of magnitude. So I think we can see that there are policy and product tweaks that can be made to at least minimize the potential violent impact and non-violent impact of that disinformation. But how do we incentivize them to do that? And I think the question then becomes, for those platforms that have made a choice to be encrypted, they also do have to face up to the fact that they are increasing risk in some ways. And I know that the UK government in their regulation proposals are looking at how to deal with that question and how a company that can't look at the data itself is meant to assess how risky that is and what processes they can put in place to try and minimize that risk as much as possible. I don't think that we should be making disinformation illegal. I think that that's offline or online goes very close to the Chinese and Russian models we're seeing at the moment, and that's not going to help a liberal society to flourish. But I do think that the regulation could be put in place to minimize risk.
Lovely, thank you. Who else wants to come in? Yeah?
I was thinking quite similar to say to that, actually. So, yeah, around this issue of how should we tackle online misinformation and fake news, and whether we should perhaps criminalize it or do something in the law. I mean, I think that's a really mistaken approach to tackling this problem. And I think it's because when we talk about misinformation or fake news, we need to talk about what the problem is that creates. And often it's a problem because misinformation can be used to manipulate electoral outcomes, or that's the idea. Or it can be used as a way of spreading hate speech, or it can do something which has a tangible harm. But untruths in themselves are not necessarily a problem. So I could go on social media and set up accounts across all the big platforms, and I could start spreading lies just for the fun of it. I could make things up. I could say, like underneath my bed, there's a pink elephant who wheezes champagne and poos gold. And that's fine, there's nothing wrong with that. That in itself is not a problem. The problem comes when I want to do something which might cause someone harm or manipulate an outcome or have some other effect. And I think this comes to what you were talking as well about. We want there to be some computational solution to this problem. But I think the problem isn't fake news. The problem is what fake news leads to and what fake news comes from. And I think we need to think about ways of tackling those problems and sort of maybe recognize that misinformation or fake news is just one part of that picture.
Anything you'd like to come in on, Yuna?
Yeah, so I certainly agree what Chloe and also Bertie said about this sort of the kind of the way in which we should take in more sort of appropriately to tackle this problem. I was also thinking, nowadays with this AI technology employed by all the social media platforms, they have a kind of a privilege to collect lots of personal data, right? And because of this personal data they collected, then they can actually do much better kind of a job in sort of doing this recommendation, or sort of to push some of the information or some sort of news which you actually have a strong interest in seeing these things. But then by doing so, actually you kind of only exposed to very specific angle of the problem, right? So basically I guess the important aspects of all this kind of fake news is you probably should be exposed to wider range of different voices or different sort of kind of facts. So that's the most important thing. But then because of how this a social media platform policy set up, and then also they basically have their own kind of incentive to keep you come back to their platform more often. So they do this personalized services. But because of that, basically they also kind of limit your sort of exposure to more wider, kind of angles of different aspects of the events. So I think that's also another problem, basically.
Rob?
Yeah, I think the WhatsApp example is particularly interesting, and Chloe's remarks about how some technical tweaks have helped to mitigate what has seen to be perhaps a growing problem in the way that that particular technology is used. I think one might speculate that the reason people are turning to WhatsApp and using it perhaps in ways that weren't initially envisaged is because they now know that if they put out such thoughts in open fora, then they will attract the attention of the authorities and so forth. And so they're seeking environments where they can do this in privacy. And I think that makes us then think about how we, our social values and whether privacy should be the priority over perhaps for example, accountability. Accountability is an important relationship that we have to, I think, discharge with our fellow citizens. And what privacy does is it enables us to escape being accountable. And I think certainly the examples that the gentleman mentioned, reveal how accountability is being denied because privacy is being seen as being more important than being accountable. The other thing I just wanted to pick up on is, I think Bertie very rightly said that there's something going on in the world which is beyond fake news as such. You can't explain why it's become so commonplace. We are living in times politically that are very interesting, shall we say, distinct from the politics that people have known in past generations. And you might say that perhaps one of the measures that we need to take in order to fix the problem of fake news is to fix politics. That the political system is broken, and that is why people are now showing so much lack of faith in sources of information that they associate with the political system, and therefore they're turning towards sources that claim to be independent of the political system and to speak, for the true feelings of people. So I think besides reforming and bringing in measures that will help to manage the problem of fake news, we have to also think very carefully about how we reform politics and take away perhaps people's inclination then to mistrust what they hear from sources that they once upon used to trust.
There you see, you come here and you get everything from neural networks to let's overthrow the political system and start and replace it with a new one. Never let it be said we don't cover the full range of issues in these debates. And now we've got some more time to come out to you for your thoughts. So I did see this hand right at the start, so if we could, I'm sorry, I know you're right at the opposite end from the microphone. This right over this corner, this guy had his hand up before, and you had your hand up before. So let's start with you, and then when we get the microphone to you, and then we'll work backwards. Off you go.
Thanks. I think that social media have changed our idea of what news is. It's now no longer just celebrity news like the tabloids had before. It's not only politics. It's now very, very personal news that is news. And so I think people are faced with this information overload. There's so much news coming in all the time, and our brains are also not made for this constant data flow. So I was just wondering, and also mental health problems are on the rise because people feel overwhelmed. Some people no longer engage with news or politics because they feel overwhelmed. So I was wondering if we perhaps need to look more at how to prioritize certain issues and events, and how that's also being done on the wider social political platforms. Which events are we actually talking about, and which can we perhaps manage? Because otherwise, if we feel there's too much, then as we all know, then we feel we can't do anything, and that leads to paralysis. So I think we need to perhaps redefine what we see as news.
So slightly coming back to Rob's thought about bring back intermediation. And okay, really interesting, thanks. So you have the microphone, and then we'll keep your hands up and we'll get the microphone around. Okay, yeah.
Okay, great. First, thank you very much for your presentations. As a doctoral candidate in AI applications for the public sector, this is an issue very dear to my heart. I've got three kind of brief questions, so I'm just going to go through them one by one. The first is when should AI not be used to govern AI? The second is in the context of automated labeling and rapid context recognition. Are we in a disinformation race in the sense of, we're dealing with more complicated actors using like GPT-2 and a lot of the stuff coming out of OpenAI?
Sorry, this is a good sign of a well-informed audience when I have to ask the audience to be less technical. What is GP?
Oh, automated text generation.
Okay. Thank you.
From OpenAI, sorry. And you mentioned some of the ways in which we're understanding institutional approaches to regulating or looking at fake news. Could you give more thoughts on how we should be, as an audience or as a public, giving a hierarchy to which one of them should we be pursuing first or next, and when? In the context of Elon Musk's recommendation for Pravda, where we give a ranking to each journalist, or other approaches to applying epidemiological models to the spread of fake news to identify like what populations are most susceptible to targeting. Thank you.
Okay, that was good. You packed a lot of questions into a very short space of time. Well done. Be like this guy, except fewer questions. Okay, good. Who's got the microphone now? Hands up over here. Come on, we need to get this moved around. Did you still want to ask? No? Okay. So that microphone to there. Who's over this side? Okay, so if you'd like to get that microphone to there. That lady there, and then we'll do you first because you've got the mic, and then we'll come to you.
Okay, it feels like a very lowbrow question after that one, but I sometimes go on the Yahoo website. I've got a very old email address there, and I sometimes look at the stories, click on the comments, and I've noticed people seem to be very similar views. What I'm just interested in is, do people of particular views congregate on Yahoo, or are these nasty, robots of some sort? I find the comments extremely illiberal, and there are lots of thumbs up for what I find unpleasant comments. I'm just really curious about platforms. Do they attract, or is that just a reflection of people who are out there sort of commenting?
So is it particular platforms attract different views?
I'm wondering, because
is that just what all comments are like? I mean, there is a rule of thumb that says just never read the comments.
I know that, and I know I shouldn't because it says my blood
pressure. And I always struggle with that because it's like, on the one hand, I'm all about public debate. On the other hand, you go, is that a debate though? Is that just an angry person in their bedroom? So I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on this. Excellent, good, thank you. And you have the microphone now.
So in terms of the trust issue that we raised before, I would personally argue that it's probably deeper rooted than just trust. So why is there this lack of trust either with politicians or even within the general public? So is it like a vicious cycle? So is fake news allowing people to be less trustworthy of either journalists or politicians or anyone, and then therefore that just, you know, keeps perpetuating this idea of, you know, should I be trusting whoever is giving me this news, and if so, why, and if so, why not? And I was just wondering if that's rooted deeper within society rather than just this idea of trust.
Very good, important, deep question. We may not comprehensively answer it this evening, but we're going to have a good go. Okay, let's take one more if we can. Yes. Oh, we've got a question coming by the magic of technology.
We've got two actually. One's very short
even better.
and responds to the presentation earlier. If only 12% of us in Britain trust social media, why do we use it so much?
That's a really good question. Whoever that is with that question.
And the second one is a little bit more detailed. How can social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter make it easier for users to report fake news? Experiences of attempting to report anything, I think, have not been positive. ...
Well, very good and specific question. So again, thank you, whoever you are. If the platforms are so keen to do something about it, how can they make it easier for... I mean, essentially, if we're the ones reading this stuff and going, no, that's wrong, surely it should be easy for us to play our part in policing it. Okay, well, there's loads of stuff that's come in now, thanks to the guy asking basically us to give him his entire doctoral thesis. From, don't think we hadn't spotted that, to the much more down-to-earth questions, and two really good questions come in remotely. So who would like to start? If between you can address everything, that'd be great, but don't all try to answer everything or we'll be here till midnight. Who'd like to kick off?
I think I probably would start one of your questions relating to, you mentioned this GPT stuff, right? So whether this kind of like AI technology actually complicated this problem, right? So make it automatic detection of fake news even more difficult. I think so. I mean, certainly. So I guess you have seen the automatic generator in fake news from my slides, and also a deep fake kind of example from Bertie's slide, right? So obviously, those AI tools, when they develop, they can also use for malicious purpose, right? So not just for use for any legitimate kind of a purpose. But then, I mean, obviously, there has already been some work to try to tackle this problem. I believe deepfake, they actually also release their data set. So to enable researchers or people to create a better machine learning model to actually to be able to detect those kind of manipulated or created kind of videos. And then in terms of GPT-2, I mean, obviously it can generate very coherent kind of a text. However, I mean, we have done some experiments using GPT-2. I mean, at that time, we actually want to do this automatic response generation in responding to patient reviews. And then the kind of things we discover is, although GPT-2 can generate a very coherent text, it actually kind of generates some off topics. So not directly responding what we actually expect to see. So there is still some limitation with these models, which means it will make it possible for us to train some other machine learning model to actually to detect whether this kind of text generator by journalists or by human being, or actually text generator by machine. So I mean, obviously there is a risk, but then there's also opportunity provided by this more advanced AI techniques. And I guess this is how we actually keep in advancing these AI techniques to be able to do good things for the human being.
Can I push back a little bit on the idea of a disinformation arms race a bit? I think there are some very highly resourced actors in the world, like states, who probably are looking into that kind of development of technology. But as someone who looks at disinformation every day on the internet and at the moment is embroiled in the lovely job of looking at the UK elections disinformation ecosystem, the bar is still really low. And what we see most is not kind of lots and lots of outright false content, but actually the misrepresentation of communities, misrepresentation of popularity, so making things seem more popular than they are.
Is this a Lib Dems bar chart point?
Well, they did do that a little bit, didn't they? And misrepresentation of identity, so kind of sock puppet accounts in communities. And often it's not outrageous content, it's not even hateful, it's not false. they're embedded there for a long time just to kind of slowly push different communities into a more extreme version of themselves. And I think that's a really successful tactic when you have societies that are quite divided. I don't think you need deep fakes and massively sophisticated technology to create false news. I think you have very easy ways of trying to manipulate audiences through deception, which don't require that. I'll quickly answer the online question that we got about the 12% of people who trust news. Great question. I'd say 3 things for the reason that we still use these platforms. One is addiction, and they are built to be addictive. One is monopolies. We don't have any other options for online services. And one is convenience. I still use Uber. I know Uber has a pretty bad track record with how it treats its workers, how it treats user data, but I choose it for convenience's sake. So I think those are probably the 3 buzzwords there.
And also, I mean, is it not fair to say that one of the things social media does very well is connect us to each other, and that even though we may not trust the news content that we read, we like to be in touch with other human beings, either people we know in the real world or people we don't know in the real world, but we strike up human contact with.
Yes, many positives to social media. Let's not just focus on the negatives, but that human connection part can be important. Yeah.
Okay, so if you two could answer all the other questions in about 2 minutes each, so we have time for more, that'd be great.
Well, I'll just say one remark. We don't have to use these platforms. I think a lot of people, for example, are reported anyway, this might be fake news, but reported to have left Facebook, although that apparently isn't as easy as it sounds. At least ignore it anyway when it tries to lure you back in. So we all have choices, and if we don't believe in the value proposition, and indeed the company ethos, then we have a choice to depart and perhaps take our interests and revenue, in effect, elsewhere. So I think we should bear that in mind. I also think that it's worth mentioning here this moment some studies of disinformation campaigns, and I'm thinking about the studies of the so-called Internet Research Agency, or IRA, which is believed to be strongly associated with the Russian government. And it's interesting that studies of the posts that have been identified with IRA accounts reveal that they're not simply in the business of trying to disseminate falsehoods. If you look in detail about what activities they are performing, they actually get involved in both sides of debates and seem, in fact, perhaps more credible sort of analysis of what they're doing is they're just trying to sow confusion so that people don't know what to believe anymore. And that perhaps is the real threat of misinformation. It's not that you necessarily think one version of the truth is more reliable than another, but you simply don't think there's any reliable information out there. And I think that, in effect, really represents a bigger threat to society than simple misinformation.
Very good point. So what would you like to pick up on, Bertie?
Gosh.
Don't feel you have to answer
left?
everything, but...
Okay. Yeah, I think I'll tackle this problem of the content that you see on different platforms, which is a brilliant question, not at all lowbrow, very important question in online research. So we know that there are systematic differences in the types of users which use different platforms. So we know that people on Twitter are, say, more likely to be younger, male, better educated, and slightly better off than the internet users in general and the general population. Then we also know there are important differences between countries. So in America, I believe that they're typically not better off. They're more likely to be younger and male, but you don't have that that additional feature. And these are really important features when we think about online spaces. And whenever we read research into these online spaces, we have to bear that in mind, because there's no reason why the people who did that research actually got a representative sample. I mean, you shouldn't make that assumption. You should make the opposite assumption, that the sample's very biased. And so therefore, the things we find out about it are themselves also biased. The issue around comments is also really interesting, because a lot of news websites have now shut down their comments sections. They've decided that it's just too difficult. And there was some really interesting research that came out, I think, about a year and a half ago, which said that anyone can be a troll on a news comment section. Anyone who goes there, who most of the time is just a normal person who doesn't say horrible stuff, when they get down into sort of like the 5th or 6th or 7th comment, and they just can't help themselves, and they say something horrible. That's a very high-level summary of the research. There's a lot of nuance that I haven't got into. And so they've shut down these comment sections. And actually, that's led to an even weirder thing that's happened, which is, I'm sure some people here have heard of Gab, which is like a very well-known far-right platform. The people behind Gab have also made a new plugin for your browser, which is called Dissenter. And that lets you go onto any website on the web and start building out your own news comment section. So anyone else who has that plugin can see your comments on that web page. Only people with the plugin as well, I should add. And that's actually led to a whole rise of new far-right rhetoric, because they now have a space which is completely unmoderated that they can go to, and they can all comment on it and see it and say whatever they like. So I guess the kind of thing I'm getting at there is everything we do to try and clean up online spaces, to take sensible, practical, responses to these things, can create unforeseen, unexpected problems, which we then have to try and find a way of dealing with. And so we're never going to have just this single solution to the problem.
Okay, on that slightly disillusioning note, I'm going to come back out and try and take as many points as I can. You see, just as I said, you've all got your hands up. I'm going to take executive decision that we're going to overrun a little because we started late. Norwich people, sorry, we've had stuff going on in London. We couldn't really do anything about it. So I'll try and keep your comments pithy, and I'll try and get everybody in, and then I will let the panel sum up and answer whatever they can. So where are the microphones? Let's start at the back this time. So we've got a cluster of hands here, and maybe get that microphone down to this guy who did and then didn't and now does again, want to say something. But so who's got the microphone there? Okay, yeah, good.
Hi, thank you. A couple of people on the panel have spoken about the ultimate need is to reform the political system, given that politicians probably don't want to do that and will ask media or social media to reform themselves before they get to themselves. What does the panel think that regulation could look like? Is it some kind of tax on the social media companies and that money is put into editorial control, verification of user accounts, or what have you? So very interested in the panel's thoughts on what regulation would look like.
Brilliant and very concise, thank you. So you go, and then if you'd like to get that microphone to the next person by the aisle there. Yeah.
Coincidentally, that was almost exactly the same topic I was going to ask. I was going to ask...
All right, you can let him finish his sentence.
To what extent you think holding the large internet companies accountable for the information they're publishing or broadcasting, because they seem to me indistinguishable from publishers or broadcasters, since they're selling engagement and the engagement is based on the content that they're pushing. So I'm not quite clear why they're not accountable for that.
Yeah, publisher or platform.
They're clearly publishing, because it's not, it's transparently the case that they're not a telephone network, because a telephone network doesn't broadcast, they're broadcasting. I'm not just messaging the people I'm talking to. If I publish on their platform, it's not always the same amount of people that get to see what I say. They change that based on how engaging they think what I'm saying is. So they're clearly publishing, I think.
Very good. Good point, useful distinction. Let's just pass the microphone to the person behind you, actually, and then we'll come to you. So, yes, off you go, whoever's got the mic. Yeah. Yeah, you with the microphone. Speak into the microphone.
Thank you. In a very brief comment, if I may. Been listening with great interest to the debate, both on the stage and around the room. I've also been looking at the summary comments on Twitter. And of course, as soon as we select or admit something, we're introducing bias. So I wonder if there's a slight paradox here. We're sitting in this room worried about fake news and the dissemination or the selection of ideas. Have we not just contributed to it as well?
Wow, a meta comment on the, so I'd like to see what someone's going to tweet about that comment about selecting what to tweet, and then we're really down the rabbit hole. Okay, so come to you, and then we'll come to you. Yeah.
Hi, I actually wanted to query Rob's point about the idea that we have a choice in social media. I think there's many places around the world where classical reporting structures can't be trusted, and actually the platform gives an opportunity of freedom of speech where there isn't one. And then, to be continuously controversial, Bertie, looking at potential reform of internet tech giants, I think there's more to be done with the kind of recommendation algorithms. I think a good example is the reporting done on the riots in Ferguson. If you went onto Twitter when the riots were going on, you could see active reporting versus when you're on Facebook, because of how the recommendation systems are done based on like likes and shares. Actually, at the time, what was much more popular was looking at ice bucket challenges. So I think there's like ways that we can actually improve these systems so the right news is being broadcasted and can promote freedom of speech.
Thank you. And that's almost like the flip side, isn't it, to if they're publishers, they should exercise some control. So the really thorny problem. Off you go.
Thank you. Some of the worst lies on the web are made possible simply because people can post them anonymously, as is also the case of some of the worst threats to women MPs. So I wondered, is this issue of posting things anonymously, is that a stable door that's impossible to close, or has any serious work been done on that?
Okay, anonymity, another constant and thorny problem, because for some people it's a defence that they need, and some people it's a defence, as you say, to do terrible things. Okay, so last comments, like hands up, anyone else that wants to speak? Oh God, there's loads of you. Okay, so microphones are there. Keep your hands up so we can get the microphones around quickly. Can you get it over to that one there? That hand to there? Oh, sorry, it's a guy right by you. A guy right by you. Okay, so who's got the mic here? Yes, off you go.
Hi, thank you for the discussion. I'll be very concise. We've talked a lot about politics-related fake news, but I was wondering what was the panel's views on health-related fake news, because we've mentioned, I think Bertie mentioned that we can always have a perspective on what's the truth and what's not, and in health, because it's so dynamic, we're always evolving and we can't just eradicate some beliefs in traditional medicine and in whatever. So yeah, I wondered about that.
Very, very good point. So, for example, people say vaccination is dangerous, or horribly topical. I think some health workers have just been murdered in Africa who were trying to deal with Ebola because there's a conspiracy theory about that. Okay, good. So who's got the microphone there? Off you go. Hi. Everybody else, hands back up if you want to speak. Go on. Yeah, you go.
So I want to go back a bit to the AI problem, to merge it with the fake news problem. I want to hear your opinion on AI developing its own reasons and mechanisms to deceive.
Okay, good. So we are in Blade Runner month, after all. Is the AI already working on telling all of us lies? There's a big thought to take away. Okay, thank you. So off you go. Anyone else? There was a hand along there, wasn't there? Yeah, okay. So if you'd like to get that mic to there, and off you go.
I'm wondering if we could start simple and basic about developing better critical judgment in the public, to take Chloe's criteria for transparency, get Yulin to turn them into a traffic light system, then use Robert's, get Robert's intermediaries to use the traffic light system on some of their basic platforms, to get the public to be using their judgment to disincentivize some of the incentives that Bertie thinks are responsible for fake news, for keeping fake news going or incentivizing fake news. Could you all put your heads together and do some basic thing for the public, the way we decide now what foods we're eating based on how much salt and sugar, etc. they have?
There, I like this. We've got the A-team on the platform. Yeah, you're just going to lock you in here after the event and you've solved it. Good out. So Hughes, you got the microphone. It's the last chance for the people. Hands up if you want to speak. Go on, you go.
Right. Yeah, so I would be really interested to know everyone's opinion on how much of this sort of situation that we have now is an unavoidable consequence of the democratization of information and education, because it is completely novel and different from what was before, but until quite like half a century ago, it was only a very restricted elite of the population that had access to the political discourse and the education that is spread around. So I'm not at all arguing for a return to that, because I think there's like so many things that have come by lowering the barriers of entry. But is it possible to decouple the worst of human nature and still give access to this platform to everyone?
Very good point, and put it in historical context. Okay, so we've got one more hand up there. So if you could pass your microphone to that guy, and we've got one more hand here. If we get the microphone to this guy here, at this end. So if you've got it, go ahead. Have you got the mic? Yeah, go ahead.
Me?
Yeah. You.
Just like to make a comment about the big tech companies. I can't remember the exact figures, but it was a few years ago. George Osborne came out and said, "Oh, Amazon's paid X amount of $1 million," which was a tiny portion of what their revenues or profits. I don't remember which one. But the fact that the politicians all over the world are beholden to big corporations, Amazon, the big tech companies, I can't really see that they're going to rein them in at all.
Okay, good and pithy point. So you have the last word from the audience, no pressure.
Oh, great. Can you paint a picture in which the combination of political culture and technology actually allows for good quality information to crowd out fake news and bad quality information? Or is that just not conceivable to you?
That's great. I like that. So we call from the audience for a positive vision. So, panel, we are over time, but I decided to do that because we started late and there's so many good things. So what I think I'll do is I'll take you again in the same order that we started with. Obviously, you can't answer all those brilliant questions, so you will just all have to stay and we'll have to hack them out in the bar afterwards, as we always do. Or on Twitter in highly selective points. But whatever you would like to come back on, or other points that you would just like to make to sum up, this is your chance.
Oh, me?
Yes. I'm going to take the same order as at the start. And as always, try and keep it pithy, because you're now basically the only thing between these people and the wine. Sorry, Norwich, I'm sure you have wine. You have to sort that out for yourselves. And sorry to keep you, because we started late, but, what else are you going to do in Norwich? Stick with us.
Well, so I'd like to comment on regulation and accountability. I think that some kind of regulation is inevitable, partly to instantiate what we mean by accountability of platforms, and to clarify as de facto publishers that they need to exercise some responsibility for what they allow to go out on their platforms and to their users. So that's about defining governance for social media. I think a second sort of arm, if you like, of regulation would be to look at whether, in fact, these platforms have grown too large. The gentleman saying that they're too powerful for politicians to really take on. They are very powerful, and they're growing more powerful. And the interesting thing is that companies like Facebook are no longer growing because they're innovative, which might have been a justification for them growing in the first place. They're growing because they are rapidly snapping up any rivals that emerge. So they bought Instagram, they bought WhatsApp, and that just really kind of cements the power that they have. So I think we have to think about breaking them up. And making them, if you like, turning them into entities that are more manageable by society by limiting the amount of financial power and influence that they can exercise. The freedom of speech question is a very, very difficult one, and someone rightly pointed out technology enable freedom of speech in polities where people don't enjoy that. On the other hand, freedom of speech in those where we're more accustomed to it and we think of ourselves living in a free society, is actually undermining that free society, arguably. So I think there's perhaps something here that tells us that that technology needs to be adapted to the circumstances in which it's being deployed. And one of the problems is we're dealing with technologies that are now global, and they don't fit the needs of individual societies. And we need to think about how to make them adapt to individual societies that are in different stages of economic and social development. What we have is a global model of technology, of social media, and I don't think it's congruent with the different kinds of societies that they're trying to serve. So that's really what I would say we need to reflect on. These are very, very difficult questions, and I think the audience has made our job tonight very difficult in trying to come up with solutions, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done before we can be really confident that we are evolving the technologies into forms that are compatible with society's needs. We've been through a very rapid phase of innovation in which I think many of us are finding ourselves struggling to keep up and trying to understand what these technologies are good for and what they're not so good for. And this means that innovation has, to some extent, got out of control. And innovation has worked partly because these technologies avoid the existing regulation that was in place. Regulation is trying to catch up, and there's a long way to go, I think, before we can match the governance, the social and political structures that can accommodate and make these technologies work to meet the needs that we have as society.
Thank you, Rob. So, Yulan, what would you like to?
Yeah, so I probably want to comment on whether AI has this reasoning capability to actually deceive people, right? Deceive us. So I would say that in the current status of AI technologies, is still far from being able to perform automatic reasoning. So basically, for a human to do the reasoning, they will require lots of background knowledge, like common sense knowledge, and then also some implicit knowledge built from past experience. Now, in that sense, AI is actually very poor in to do this kind of reasoning and then build on this sort of external knowledge. So at the moment, I think most AI technologies, they are pretty much kind of close to pattern recognition. So basically, we feed the machine learning model lots of data, and then this kind of AI model actually try to learn the regularities from the data. That's it. However, I would say that AI actually would have some kind of bias. I mean, this bias will actually come from the sort of bias of the AI designers. So, for example, whoever train this kind of AI model, then basically depending on what kind of training data they use, right? And then what kind of a specific algorithm they use to train the model. So the outcome might be the kind of AI model suffer from this data bias and then also algorithm bias problem. Now there has been kind of active research to actually research into sort of almost reduce the bias of this AI model. The other thing is the sort of AI model developed would be actually possible be kind of so-called attacked by other people, so people with some sort of malicious purpose. So they would create some kind of sort of fake data or sort of data with some kind of specific noise to try to fool the AI model. So again, there has also been research going on to do this, sort of adversarial attack on the AI models, and then what kind of defense methodologies we can actually adopt to make the AI model more robust to those external attacks.
Lovely, thank you. Bertie, what are your final thoughts?
Yeah, so I think I'd like to talk about this thing of content moderation and regulation. And I think a lot of what we've talked about today is how do we identify fake news? And of course, that's a really important part of the puzzle that we have to solve. But there's also another part, which is what do we do once we've identified it? And I think you were talking about this when it comes to the sort of the prominence of different stories, say on Facebook or on other social media platforms. And this is a big question because the timelines that we see, the information we're exposed to, that's been algorithmically generated. There are a series of decisions and inputs which get taken into account to feed us out our timeline. And we need to think about how the quality of information can perhaps feed into that so that we don't amplify fake news or hate speech or any form of online harms. But I think what we do once we've identified content that we think is problematic or is harmful is as important as how we identify that content. And we always talk about bans. It's almost like this assumption that we're going to identify stuff we don't like and then we're going to take it down and we're going to restrict freedom of speech and that's just what we're going to do. And that's not the case, because there's so many other things we can do. We actually heard about this already with WhatsApp. You can limit the amount of times that something is shared. That's one way of stopping the spread of misinformation or fake news or any type of harmful content. So that's the first thing. The second thing to talk about is sort of regulation at a slightly higher level. And I think there really is a strong case in the UK for more regulation of the big social media platforms. Over summer, DCMS and the Home Office released the Online Harms White Paper, which I hope some people have heard of and was a very interesting read around how we need to regulate the big tech companies. And I think that is the case, but I think at the same time we have to think about regulation is not beating companies with a stick and telling them that they're doing things awfully wrong and imposing fines. It's about working with companies to improve their processes, improve transparency reporting, help them to work out how we can solve some of these issues, and also not to let them solve these issues on their own. Because I think what none of us wants is the big social media platforms to start deciding what's true and false, what you can see and what you can't see. So I guess almost to sum up, I sort of have to end where Rob started, which is that these are socio-technical systems and they're incredibly complicated, and we need to think through in a very deep way how we're going to tackle these problems rather than just saying that there's a simple solution.
Thank you very much. So Chloe, you get the last word. If again you could answer everything,
Yeah.
leave us with this positive vision of a society in which...
I was going to give you a really very strangely optimistic ending, which is unlike me, but there we go. I'll try. Can we have a system in which the political culture and the tech come together to create a good system? Yes, we can. And here is my plan for how you do it. You start with regulation based around transparency. And there are proposals in France that sadly have not won out over some other proposals, but proposals nonetheless that propose a really crunchy definition of what transparency looks like and how a government can incentivize and compel companies to be more transparent, not just about content, but about all of these processes that Bertie was just talking about, how they run their platforms, what risk assessment they have in place, how they make decisions, how they protect their users, what the balance of commercial versus safety is in their decision making. Because we can't actually regulate properly and effectively if we can't see more of the problem. So that's number one. And then where do you go? You go step two, and you go to the UK model or something similar, which takes a duty of care legal approach. And that is preventative, and it's proportional, and it's risk-based. So you're not impinging on freedom of speech because you're not looking just at content and removal. You're looking at how a company, like any other business, should be doing its utmost to do what it can proportionally and responsibly to protect its users from all kinds of harm. And third, what you do is you take the German approach that they recently tried in the Competition Authority, and you say to all of the biggest companies, if you are a monopoly in our country, you have a higher standard of care and a higher standard of data care for our users, and it will compel sanctions on those companies that don't live up to that. Facebook might have appealed that, and they might have won, but it's still a good idea. So that's my step-by-step process for regulation. My optimistic self says that we're not all that far away from a world where in liberal democracies, we can come up with a way of letting tech and political society work together in a much more harmonious relationship.
Fantastic. How nice to end on a positive, specific and optimistic note. Before I get you to thank the panel and rush out to the bar, I think we have another upcoming event that we'd like to... There you go. So there's an upcoming event. Turing presents AI UK next March, so book now for that. Good, literally, people are literally making note of that. That's exactly what you should be doing. And now we're going to take this discussion where all good discussions belong, which is outside in the bar. So before you do that, please thank the fantastic panel for a great discussion. Thank yourselves for your great questions. Thank the organisers, thank the technicians, and thank you, Norwich.